My name is Mario Kohara. I'm an assistant professor of art and architectural history here in the School of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame. And it's my great pleasure, privilege to introduce Dr. Caspar Pearson, our speaker this evening. Dr. Pearson is an art and architectural historian whose area of expertise is in the Italian Renaissance. His scholarship is characterized by a rigorous study of both the history of architecture and the history of ideas, something very few people can do truly well, I believe. We see these two areas of interest mapped out in Dr. Pearson's education. He attended the University of Birmingham in the UK, where he studied both philosophy and art history, and it was there that he also earned his master's degree in art history. He subsequently received his PhD from the University of Essex, where his doctoral project on architecture and urbanism in the works of Leon Battista Alberti married those two areas of interest together. Something that many of us in the Notre Dame community have in common with Dr. Pearson is time spent in Rome. Dr. Pearson held postdoctoral fellowships and teaching appointments in Rome, while also writing and publishing his research on Alberti. Since, fast forward since 2020, Dr. Pearson has served as Director of Studies at the Warburg Institute in London. If you're unfamiliar with the Warburg, it is a premier center for art historical research, which offers graduate programs for MA and PhD students and fellowship opportunities for scholars. The Warburg Institute's library holds a collection of international importance in the humanities. Its 360,000 volume collection make it the largest collection in the world focused on Renaissance studies and the history of the classical tradition. The founder of the Institute, Aby Warburg, scholar of Renaissance art history himself, believed that the memory of the past activates the present, and the Institute today continues to support global cultural history and the role of images in society according to that core belief. I'll just say a few more words about Dr. Pearson's scholarship before handing over the mic this evening. His first book, Humanism and the Urban World, Leon Battista Alberti and the Renaissance City, appeared in print in 2011 from Pennsylvania State University Press. His most recent book, which appeared in 2022, is also about Alberti, called The Chameleon's Eye. This volume is part of Reaction Books' Renaissance Lives series. And through these two books and his various journal article publications, Dr. Pearson has given us new frameworks for understanding this important 15th century figure. Alberti is someone who is difficult to grasp fully, even for specialists. Often referred to as the first universal man, Alberti was a polymath who worked not only as an architect and a humanist scholar, but also as a linguist, philosopher, playwright, art critic, and a mathematician, among other things. Florentine by birth, but often living abroad in exile, even his contemporaries called Alberti a chameleon, an animal capable of blending in with whatever environment it chooses to inhabit, while remaining in reality an outsider to all. And as a result, historians have tended to fall into two traps, either worshiping Alberti as a superhuman, heroic polymath, like our statue outside does, or vilifying him for his individualism and dilettante amateurism. Through his research, though, Dr. Pearson shows us how Alberti's theoretical formulations, particularly as they relate to architecture and urbanism, link up with his personal biography in subtle, nuanced ways, peeling back the costume layers to get at the heart of Alberti's intentionality, especially in relationship to his thoughts about space making. Tonight, the lecture is titled Architecture, Representation, and Politics, Leon Battista Alberti on the City-State. Please join me in welcoming Caspar Pearson.
Hey, well, thank you for that incredibly kind introduction. I always think I sound better in the third person, hearing myself being described by someone else. I'm very grateful to have been invited to speak here in the renowned School of Architecture at Notre Dame. Apart from anything else, it is quite something as a scholar who works on Leon Battista Alberti to come to a place that has a 13-foot high bronze sculpture of the man. In his treatise on painting, Alberti says that the great work of the painter is not a colossus, but a historia, or a history painting. But I suspect he would have changed his mind if he'd seen that statue. In any case, this seems a very fitting place to be speaking about Alberti. So, just a quick introduction for those of you who are not familiar with him, and a recap for those of you who are. Alberti, let me just advance this. Oh. Oh. Okay, I can advance it. This. Oh. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so Alberti was born in Genoa in northern Italy in 1404, and he lived until 1472. He was a humanist scholar, so fundamentally, he was a moral philosopher who also wrote treatises on the visual arts, including a major work on architecture, De Re Edificatoria, or On the Art of Building, which was the first architectural treatise to be produced in Europe since ancient times. In later life, in a move that was at the time unprecedented for a humanist, he actually turned to practice and began to operate as an architect. And it's in connection with architecture and urbanism that I want to talk about him today. But I'm going to do so not in relation to his architectural treatise or to the handful of buildings that he was involved in designing, but through some of his other works in which he thinks in a more oblique way about buildings in the city. And above all, the city of Florence, where his family originally came from. In particular, I want to explore how his thoughts about Florence and its buildings might be inflected by an especially pictorial mode of thinking. So how his thinking about architecture is inflected by his thinking about paintings. Okay, so first of all, just a bit of background about the Alberti family, as this will set the scene for what follows. So the Alberti were one of Florence's elite families, and they were key players in the city's Republican government in the 1300s. They were the owners of a huge international banking business, which stretched from Northern Europe all the way to the Near East. And by the 1370s, they had become, according to some contemporaries, the richest citizens of Florence. And there was quite a lot of competition. It's a place where there's a lot of rich people. They were apparently, for a while, the richest. Increasingly active in politics, they aligned themselves with the Ricci family, the leaders of what is sometimes called the liberal faction, which basically favored a slightly wider participation in the Republican government. Now, when a proletarian revolution led by the Ciompi, those are the wool workers, the workers in the wool industry, sprang up, erupted in 1378, the two most prominent Alberti, Benedetto di Nerozzo, that's the grandfather of Leon Battista, and his cousin, Cipriano di Duccio, they immediately jumped on the revolution's coattails and they lent it their support. And Benedetto was rewarded with a knighthood. From that point on, for almost 10 years, he and Cipriano were at the very apex of the Republican system, wielding a degree of power that was unmatched by any other family. So they were basically, for about 10 years in the 14th century, they became something like, what the Medici would become for a lot longer in the 15th century. But this situation ended abruptly in 1378, when the Alberti's enemies, the oligarchic faction led by the Albizzi family, managed to regain the upper hand, and they sent the Alberti into exile. Now, the exclusion of the Alberti from Florence was a piecemeal process that initially affected only Benedetto di Nerozzo and Cipriano di Duccio. So in a first decree, they were both made ineligible for political office, and they were banned from entering any of the buildings associated with the chief organs of the state. So those are the palaces housing the signoria, that's the main government council, the podesta, that's the chief magistrate, the captain of the people, and other officials called the executors of the ordinances of justice. I'm just highlighted their palaces on the map there. So that's their first exclusion. They had to keep out of those buildings. The next day, a new decree commanded that Benedetto and Cipriano should remove themselves from Florence entirely within 8 days, and that within another 10 days, they should be at least 100 miles from the city, where they should remain for 2 years. So these were the first in a series of measures that ultimately resulted in 1401 in the banishment of all male members of the family. Some to this distance of 100 miles, others to 180 miles, and still others to a massive 300 miles from the city. And by the way, these rings aren't accurate. I tried, I couldn't. It just gives you a sense. And this state of affairs persisted for more than a quarter of a century, during which time the Alberti men orbited at these fixed distances around a city whose government still sought to regulate many aspects of their lives, even as it forbade them to approach. So when you were exiled, unless you're actually declared a rebel, you would think when you're exiled, you're just out and that's that. But actually not. You're still very much in the claws of the administration of the city because you're still a citizen. You're just a really bad citizen. So this is the situation into which Battista Alberti, better known to us through his later act of self-naming as Leon Battista Alberti. So he gives himself this name, Leo in Latin or Leone, Leon in Italian, meaning the lion. This is the situation into which he was born in Genoa in 1404. Just show me there. He was a natural, or that is to say, illegitimate child, and he was the grandson of Benedetto di Nerozzo, the man who had led the Alberti first to the great heights of success and then to the depths of failure in the 14th century. Now, by the time that the Alberti were readmitted to Florence in 1428, Battista was already an adult. A scholar called Lorenz Berninger has recently discovered and published new documents. And this is a very important find that show that Alberti was already in Florence by about 1429 and enrolled at the university as a student of canon law. So that's a degree that he must have obtained in Florence rather than in Bologna, where he had first embarked on his legal studies. Following a period in Rome, he returned to Florence in 1434 when he was 30 years old. Now, by this time, he had embarked on a literary career as a humanist scholar, and he had found employment as a bureaucrat with the papacy. And it's in this last capacity that he found himself back in the Tuscan city, following the papal curia after his employer, Pope Eugenius IV, lost his grip on the city of Rome and was driven out by a mob and stayed out for the best part of a decade. So Alberti's second sojourn in Florence seems to have coincided with what Lucia Bertolini has called a euphoric phase in his writings. And his approach to the city at this time can be closely associated with two texts in particular. So his treatise on the family, that De Familia or Della Familia, he tended to give his works Latin titles, even when they were written in the vernacular Tuscan, and his treatise on painting, De Pictura, both of which were seemingly composed first in the vernacular Tuscan dialect, although Alberti later translated De Pictura into Latin. Now, later on, he claimed that he wrote the Della Familia in Rome in 1434, though it seems that at least some of the third book must have been composed in Florence the following year, 1435. The De Pictura, on the other hand, he recorded very specifically as having been completed in Florence at 8:45 on the evening of the 26th of August, 1435. It's kind of amazing to have that kind of precision for a date. So these two works are thus near contemporary, or perhaps actually contemporary texts. And what I want to do for the remainder of my time is to read some parts of them together and to think about how they reflect on Alberti's long, phased return to Florence at the end of the family's many years of exile. So as many people here will know, probably anyone who's had to take a class in Renaissance art history, the De Pictura is a short treatise written in 3 books in which the author speaks directly in his own voice. It begins with a difficult section on optics and geometry, explaining how sight functions through visual rays that connect objects to the eye and setting out for the first time the principles of a one-point perspective construction. In the second book, Alberti comes to the heart of his discussion, introducing the concept of composition. And by this he means the bringing together of members, so that's body parts, in order to produce bodies. And he then goes on to explain how, in a painting, those bodies can then be set to work, adopting a variety of gestures and postures and expressions to create a visual narrative, or what he calls a historia. That's an intelligible image that relates a story and that also performs a sort of moral inquiry. Now, in contrast to this, the Della Famiglia, I didn't really have a good image for the Della Famiglia, but this is Alberti's own sort of emblem that he adopted for himself of the winged eye. The Della Famiglia is a much longer work. It's a fictional dialogue between members of the Alberti family that involves characters based on real people, including the author himself. Now, these characters engage in a wide-ranging discussion about family life, which touches on many subjects, including politics and the wider civic world of the Italian city-states. The part that is most often read now, and was also the most popular in the Renaissance, is the third book, in which the thrifty old patriarch, Giannozzo Alberti, explains to the young humanist Leonardo his practice of macerizia, or household economy, in a discussion that is partly modelled on ancient texts by people like Xenophon. Now, for all of their differences, these 2 texts, the treatise on painting and the treatise on the family, do share some key preoccupations. For example, both of them tend to foreground and centre the self, and both are marked by an intense concern with individual will. In the De Pictura, Alberti insists that he is the only true origin of his discourse, claiming to speak from his own experience as a painter, which is quite audacious, given that he wrote it in Florence, surrounded by excellent professional painters. He himself was an amateur at best. He relies on his own judgment, and he never submits to any higher authority. We might consider, in this regard, how he begins his account of perspective. So this is the process of making a checkerboard pavement out of orthogonal lines that all meet at a single vanishing point, and transversal lines that are placed across them at ever-decreasing intervals. Alberti describes 2 diagrams that are required to realize this order. One in which the picture is seen from the front, and a second one in which we, as it were, view the pictorial space abstractedly from the side. In this second case, lines are drawn from the eye of the ideal observer, here made monocular, so one eye, and reduced to a point, to marks on a baseline representing the true, as it were, position of the transversals. And the lines of sight are then cut with a perpendicular corresponding to the picture plane and placed at whatever distance the artist decides the painting should be viewed from. It is in this manner that the placement of the transversals is determined. Now, ultimately, this system allows the painter to produce a convincing illusion of a 3-dimensional space and to diminish in a geometrically consistent way the size of objects in a picture as they move further from the eye of the viewer. Now, when Alberti begins his explanation of all of this, he says, "Let me tell you what I do when I'm painting. First of all, on the surface on which I'm going to paint, I draw a rectangle of whatever size I want, which I regard as an open window through which the subject to be painted is seen, and I decide how large I wish the human figures in the painting to be." So the passage makes repeated use of the pronouns io, that's I, and me, and uses an insistent first person to make it clear that everything about the perspective construction, and thus the subsequent painting, rests on the author's own arbitration. As he says, I do, I want, I decide. From this passage, one gets the feeling that the mathematical nexus within which the painting is to be contained exists not only to aid mimesis per se, but also to guarantee a zone of complete control, in which the key determining factor is the painter's own gaze, which, viewed from the side, is sectioned, reified, and rendered as an objective ordering principle, one that provides the measure to which everything else must conform. Now, these preoccupations also inform some parts of the Della Familia. There, Giannozzo's practice of masserizia, or household economy, also outlines a powerful technique of control, one in which the self is again to be found at the dead center of things. The parallels are most clear in an extraordinary and vivid passage in which Giannozzo compares his own manner of arranging things to that of a spider. And what he says is this: "You have seen how the spider arranges the threads of his web in rays, so that each one of them, no matter how long, finds its beginning, its root, its point of origin in the center, where that most industrious animal dwells. Once it has woven and ordered its work, it dwells there, alert and diligent, so that if any of the threads, no matter how minute or distant, is touched, it feels it immediately, rushes there, and takes care of everything. This is what the head of the family should do. Let him study his affairs and arrange them so that they all depend on him, originate with him, and find support in the safest places. Then let him stay there in the center, vigilant and quick to hear and see everything. And if something should require his attention, let him take care of it immediately." So the simile suggests that the patriarch must construct a world that is in every way an extension of the self, a web of relations in which all things have their origin in his will alone. Moreover, this figure who stays in the center, vigilant and quick to hear and see everything, inhabits an order that is markedly spatial and visual in character. The simile might even be considered painterly, or at least pictorial, something that Giannozzo seems to announce at the start when he says that he will, and I quote, "tell you, and as it were paint for you, and place here before your eyes that which he wishes to say." There are also some commonalities between the ways in which Alberti speaks of a painting and the spider's web, since he says that both must be woven or stitched together, the word is tessuto. More strikingly, the threads, what he calls the cordicine, of the web are arranged in rays, razzi, a word which Alberti uses repeatedly in the De Pictura when describing the visual rays that are the primary vehicles of sight. And just as the visual rays converge to form a pyramid in which they all meet at a single point in the eye of the spectator, so in the web all of the rays meet at one point in the center where the spider dwells. So there are thus clear echoes in the spider patriarch's network of pure vision and control of the painter's visual pyramid, but there are also echoes of the perspective grid. I'm a massive arachnophobe. I can't, even a picture of a spider is devastating to me. So I had to search for one where there wasn't one, and it was pretty traumatic along the way, I can tell you. So there are echoes here of the perspective grid. Indeed, the spider seems to inhabit the impossible position of the vanishing point itself, or the centric point in Alberti's terms, looking out along orthogonals that now appear divergent rather than convergent, and that are crossed by transversals that form a set of concentric circles. But more than this, the simile also has an architectural character, since a literary tradition did consider spiders to be natural architects, along with bees, swallows, and so forth, as well as being natural geometers on account of the precision of their webs. And what I find particularly fascinating then is that the spider's web can be seen in this passage as the perfect fusion of architecture and picture making, since it is at once both a kind of building and a two-dimensional picture or diagram. And just as we saw that Alberti spins the theory of perspective from his own self, which he posits as the only origin, the same is manifestly and literally the case here with the spider, where everything finds its beginning and point of origin in the center, where the patriarch arranges his affairs so that he is the origin of everything and they all depend on him. So, to summarize, in Giannozzo's telling, it seems that the head of the family must try to organize his world into a kind of geometrical picture whose meaning depends entirely upon his position at the center of it. Now, if this seems to hint at a pictorial architectonic way of thinking about the world, that is to say, the organization of one's immediate ambit into a sort of historia of one's own, then we can perhaps find other such hints in the De Pictura itself. So about after a year after he had completed the first draft of the treatise, Alberti sent a more worked up version of the text to the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, attaching a letter in which he speaks of his joy at the return of the Alberti family to Florence. In the process, he heaps praise on contemporary Florentine artists, comparing them as great geniuses to giants, and commending Brunelleschi's role in the construction of the dome of Florence Cathedral, and especially his invention of a method by which it could be built without the use of wooden centering. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. So in a very often quoted passage, Alberti says, "What man, however hard of heart or jealous, would not praise Pippo," that's a sort of familiar name for Filippo, "would not praise Pippo the architect, when he sees here such an enormous construction towering above the skies, vast enough to cover the entire Tuscan population with its shadow, and done without the aid of beams or elaborate wooden supports. Surely a feat of engineering, if I'm not mistaken, that people did not believe possible these days, and was probably equally unknown and unimaginable among the ancients." So Alberti praises Brunelleschi for his engineering feat and for his outdoing of antiquity. He also makes the hyperbolical assertion that the cupola is so large that it could cover the whole of Tuscany with its shadow. Now, this striking phrase has been much interpreted, and particular attention should be drawn to Giannozzo's maxim in the Della Famiglia that if a family cannot all live under a single roof, they should try, nonetheless, all to live under a single will, something that, when scaled up to the city as a whole, evokes an all-encompassing form of social cohesion. Among the many resonances of the shadow in the letter to Brunelleschi, however, there is one that has only been commented on, so far as I know, by Mary Pardo, building on some suggestions in an essay by Giulio Carlo Argan. And that is that it is a rather pictorial or even painterly idea. Alberti himself makes a connection between shadows and paintings at the start of the second book of the De Pictura, where he says, "Quintilian believed that the earliest painters used to draw around shadows made by the sun, and the art eventually grew by a process of additions." And indeed, it must be recognized that whatever else the shadow signifies for Alberti, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the discussion if people are interested, it does seem to speak to the notion that Brunelleschi's achievement in part consists in his ability, through the construction of this building, to project an image over the entire surrounding area. In this sense, there is perhaps an implication in this letter that serves as an introduction to the treatise that Brunelleschi has forged his own historia on the grand scale of the city itself, that he has been able to reorganize it according to his own masterful gaze. And if that sounds far-fetched, and I can see how it could, then we should remember that Brunelleschi is alleged to have invented perspective and to have demonstrated it precisely by making pictures of the urban centre of Florence. Pictures that mixed painted representations with reflected images and with real views of the sky. Later on, he would be cast as the protagonist of the tale of the Grasso Legnaiuolo, that is, the story of the fat woodworker. This is a novella which tells the story of a beffa, or practical joke, in which Brunelleschi persuades the entire city to collude in a conspiracy to make the woodworker Manetto believe that he is really a different person called Matteo. So Brunelleschi thus appears as a man whose formidable ingegno, that is, intelligence or brilliance, and his mastery of illusionism allowed him to make a representation that involved the whole Florentine population, one that was so successful that he was ultimately able to persuade a man that he was not who he thought he was and that he had always had another identity entirely. As Marvin Trachtenberg has pointed out, one of the things that Brunelleschi's chief biographers, Antonio Manetti and Giorgio Vasari, seem to have been most interested in is the way in which a young, largely untried architect somehow managed, essentially through charisma and rhetorical prowess in their telling, to take control of the city's main building project. Perhaps Alberti too recognized Brunelleschi's ability to seize the narrative, as it were, and to make of Florence a historia of his own. So in that sense, the cupola might have stood for Alberti as an extraordinary act of the making of meaning, a means of bringing order to the world and infusing it with intentionality. Such an idea is supported by some of Alberti's other activities. These include his staging of a vernacular poetry contest beneath the dome in 1441. This was called the Certame Coronario, or the Contest for the Crown, where basically humanists presented poems which were sort of Latinate in their form, but translated, but they were written in the vernacular instead, in Tuscan. We might also think of his dialogue, the Profugiorum ab Eramna. You can sort of loosely translate that as the dialogue on avoiding mental anguish. It's basically how to deal with anxiety and depression in the Renaissance, which he penned a few years later in the 1440s. And there, pretty much all of the discussion is set in and around the cathedral, and the characters specifically praise the building. Perhaps in the letter to Brunelleschi, where he celebrates his return from exile, perhaps that letter is animated then by a sense of having reached a kind of center or anchor of meaning, right? Coming from the periphery of all those circles to which the Alberti were pushed out back to the center. If exile was in a way a colossal unmaking of meaning, a prolonged attack on a person's identity through innumerable acts of alienation, removing them from their social networks, disrupting their fundamental relationships with places, at the cupola, Alberti might have encountered the very opposite. Now, we've seen how in the Della Famiglia, Giannozzo, using language that is evocative of pictorial and perspectival practice, set out how one might achieve meaning, or at least order, by placing oneself at the center of a structured domestic sphere. But his spider simile is undeniably sinister. Alberti's positing of the cupola, as I have characterized it, as a meaningful center of the urban and civic world is far more positive. And yet, as some observers have remarked, his letter to Brunelleschi is not without ambivalence. A shadow can be menacing, and giants, to which he compares the great geniuses of Florence, were widely associated with physical and moral danger. Moreover, in claiming that the shadow of the cupola fell not only over Florence, but over the whole of Tuscany, Alberti seems to acknowledge the expansionist territorial ambitions of a city that commanded large swathes of territory and that had already subdued other cities, including Arezzo, Pistoia, and Pisa, bringing them under Florentine domination. This dome that was so often referred to as a vast machina, kind of machine, in other words, was also part of the enormous machinery of the state, an outstanding demonstration of the Republic's administrative capabilities and its command of resources and skills. A religious building it might be, but as the Florentine architect Filarete would later put it, the cathedral is common and public because it is constructed communally with the money of all. And indeed, the cathedral and its cupola were public works that had often shared the same workforce as the government palace, the Palazzo Pubblico. Now, both of these buildings had been planned at the end of the 13th century, and both formed part of a great architectural program that expressed and instantiated the ideology of the state. Indeed, the government palace, rather than the cathedral, could itself sometimes serve as the figurative centre of the city. In his panegyric to the city of Florence, so that's a great praise of the city, Leonardo Bruni, another humanist scholar, who for some years served as the Chancellor of Florence, had described the entire Florentine territory as a series of concentric rings. And what he said was, just as on a round buckler, so a buckler is a shield, a kind of small shield. I'm just showing you one there. You can see it's a sort of set of concentric circles. Just as on a round buckler, where one ring is laid around the other, the innermost ring loses itself in the central knob that is the middle of the entire buckler. So here we see the regions lying like rings, surrounding and enclosing one another. Within them, Florence is first, similar to the central knob, the center of the whole orbit. The city itself is ringed by walls and suburbs, and around the suburbs in turn lies a ring of country houses, and around them the circle of towns. The whole outermost region is enclosed in a still larger orbit and circle. So this movement from the inside out is then accompanied in the same text by an opposite one that moves from the outside in, as Bruni sets out a hierarchy of beauty and magnificence, arguing that the villas are more beautiful than the distant panorama, the suburbs more handsome than the villas, and the city itself more beautiful than its suburbs. And at the innermost point of this hierarchical scheme, he places the government palace. To be sure, in the centre of the city, there is a tall and handsome palace of great beauty and remarkable workmanship. This fine building bespeaks by its very appearance the purpose for which it was constructed. Just as in a large fleet, it is an easy matter to pick out the flagship that carries the admiral, who is the leader, and head over the other captains and their ships, so in Florence, everyone immediately recognizes that this palace is so immense that it must house the men who are appointed to govern the state. Indeed, it was so magnificently conceived and looms so toweringly that it dominates all the buildings nearby, and its top stands out above those of the private houses. Indeed, I do not think that I ought to call this building simply a fortress, but rather the fortress of the fortress. So this description of the palace as a fortress is certainly fitting. It is a huge, rugged structure with great crenellated battlements. At 90 meters, its imposing tower reaches almost 3 times the height permitted for private towers, emphasizing the supremacy of the Republic and seeming to aspire to that monopoly of the use of violence that Max Weber would centuries later characterize as a defining feature of the modern state. Some of you might have been there and been up the tower. You can go up and you have amazing views over the whole city. At the same time, the palace seeks to present a refined and beautiful appearance. In front of it, a large L-shaped piazza allows for excellent views of the building's 2 well-ordered facades, while also providing a place for political assembly and spectacle. Now, if Bruni admired the palace as an exemplary expression of state power, Alberti seems to have taken the opposite view for the very same reasons. In a pointed incident at the start of the 2nd book of the Profugiorum, that's that dialogue again on avoiding mental anguish, a messenger arrives requesting that the main speaker, the wise retired elder statesman Agnolo Pandolfini, should go su in Palagio, up to the government palace, in order to advise on matters of state. Now, Agnolo is very patriotic, but he declines because he says it's pointless. The officials in the palace don't really want to hear what he has to say. As an older man of experience, who has held political office and headed a large household, Agnolo bears some similarities to Giannozzo, the charismatic spider patriarch of the Della Famiglia, and this is a comparison that Alberti himself makes in the dialogue. And Giannozzo, too, at his first appearance in the Della Famiglia, explains that he is weary since he had to get up at first light and go to the government palace to intervene on behalf of a friend, perhaps referring to the Palazzo della Ragione in Padua, where the dialogue takes place, or the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, where he lived during the exile. So both Agnolo and Giannozzo, then, are familiar with the halls of power, even if they go there only out of necessity. Giannozzo, in fact, has much to say when it comes to government. And actually, the real person on whom he is based, Giannozzo di Tommaso Alberti, was the only one of the family to enjoy true political success after the return to Florence, since he attained one of the 3 highest offices of the state when he became Gonfaloniere di Compagnia in 1436. Now, undoubtedly, in the Della Famiglia, Giannozzo is proud of the Alberti's history of political participation. And he reminds the other speakers that a member of the clan had been a prior at the time when the foundations of what he calls Nostro Pubblico Palagio, our government palace, were laid. That event had taken place in 1299, and for the next nearly 90 years, the building would play an important role in the Albertis' lives. Indeed, Giannozzo says proudly that Messer Benedetto, that's Benedetto di Nerozzo, Leon Battista's grandfather, and Messer Nicolaio, another prominent family member, was so involved in affairs of state that they were, as he says, always at the palace. And yet Giannozzo is markedly negative about political participation. I think I missed a slide there. Okay. Nothing, he tells Leonardo, is less worthy of being considered an honour than taking part in the government. On one hand, after decades of banishment, we Alberti, he says, are now above such vanity. On the other hand, governance is anyway a bothersome business that ultimately brings one nothing but hatred and suspicion. So like Agnolo Pandolfini then, he is unenthusiastic about politics. And like Agnolo, he expresses a preference for a quiet, private life, preferably one lived out in the country, away from the endless noise of the city. Indeed, for Giannozzo, the city is nothing but a theatre of contention, and the government palace is the epicentre of urban strife. A country villa, he tells Leonardo, allows one to flee what he calls the uproar, the tumults and the tempests of the city, of the piazza and of the government palace. A sequence, this, terra, piazza, palagio, that represents a progressive narrowing of focus and also a hierarchy of turpitude, implying a complete inversion, at least in moral terms, of Leonardo Bruni's territorial order. If we remember, for Bruni, the palace stands at the apex of all that's good. For Giannozzo, by contrast, the city is worse than the country, its outdoor public spaces are worse than the city as a whole, and the government palace is the worst of all. So Giannozzo thus favours a private life in which he can mind his own business and stay out of the public eye. More than that, in fact, he tells the younger Alberti that one must never neglect one's own affairs for those of the Republic, except in circumstances where honour demands it, and he urges that in the final analysis, one must live for oneself, not for everyone else. Si vuole vivere a sé, non al comune. Now, these positions, which echo aspects of Epicurean philosophy, were certainly not shared by all. Indeed, they run directly contrary to expressions of militant republican fervour that are recorded as having been made in the 15th century by figures such as Rinaldo Gianfiliazzi, who declared in a government council that our city is more important than our children. So Rinaldo Gianfiliazzi is someone who won big in the power struggles in which the Alberti lost in. So, you know, we can understand why he would be enthusiastic and Giannozzo not so much. But perhaps the apogee of Giannozzo's polemic against politics comes in a highly wrought passage in which he says, "You are men worthy of hatred if you take pleasure in the perversity and sorrow which go together with public office and administration. Unless cruel and bestial by nature, what joy can one feel when he must continually listen to the complaints, laments, and sobs of orphans, widows, and unfortunate wretches? What pleasure can one feel when all day long he must welcome hordes of coarse men, swindlers, spies, slanderers, thieves, and scandalmongers, but must guard himself against them at the same time? What peace can one have who every night must twist men's limbs, hear pain-racked voices cry out for mercy, and yet must persist in horrible cruelties and must be the butcher and mangler of human limbs? How abominable to think of it! It is something that must be avoided at all costs." So the evocation of torture as a routine political practice stands out very strongly here. It does so, of course, first and foremost because of the abhorrence of the imagery that it evokes. But the language is also striking. In particular, the double incidence of the word limbs, membra in Alberti's Tuscan, in a single sentence constitutes an unusual repetition and perhaps indicates a particularly heightened affect. On the one hand, there is, of course, a sense here of the destruction of the body politic, right? The mangling of the body. On the other hand, though, I think that it is useful to remind ourselves again that Book 3 of the Della Familia and the first version of the De Pictura are essentially contemporary texts. That is to say, that at the very same time that Alberti was writing about the mangling of membra, body parts, as part of the exercise of power, he was also constructing a theory of pictorial meaning in which the assemblage of membra, body parts, to make a body, the process he calls composition, was the single most important procedure. Thus, if the construction of the cupola could be seen, as I have argued, as a pictorial act, an exemplary act of meaning-making, that transformed the city itself into a giant historia, the workings of politics might be considered its opposite, that is to say, decomposition, the reversal and disaggregation of pictorial composition, which implies also the destruction and distortion of moral clarity, meaning, and order. Now, back in 1387, the very first punishment to which the Alberti family had been subjected was the banning of Benedetto di Nerozzo and Cipriano di Duccio from entering the government palace. The decree that mandated their exile states specifically that it was made in Palatium, that is to say, in the palace. And every subsequent restriction on the family came from the same source. Perhaps then it makes a certain sense that when he returned, so to speak, not really a return because Alberti was born outside of Florence, but he presents it as a return. When he returned to Florence, Alberti could feel largely positive, even enthused about the enormous cupola. But he suspected that the palace produced little more than discordant fragments, or even, to use the Latin term. Okay, so just a very quick coda, and I'll try to summarize in a few brief remarks. So one thing that I've become increasingly convinced of in my studies of Alberti is that his intellectual positions are intimately linked with his family's historical connections to the city of Florence, first as dominant plutocrats and political operators, and then as exiles. And by the way, it's interesting, I had a great visit to the library today and saw some of the rare books, including this very fine first edition, 1485 edition of Alberti's architectural treatise, the De Rea Edificatoria, which Jennifer Parker very generously showed to me. And it just goes to show that it's always worth just leafing through a book when you see it there, because I opened it up and immediately what I saw is that in the preface that Angelo Poliziano, the humanist scholar, wrote for this edition, it's a kind of rededication to Lorenzo de' Medici. The first thing he says is that this is, this book is by Alberti from the great Alberti family, right? It's the first thing he says. So he makes that link to the family straight away. The 14th century was an immensely turbulent period in which Florentines struggled to maintain a functioning form of participatory republican government. In doing so, they faced crises that pushed their system to its limits and sometimes beyond. So they had to contend with the descent into factionalism, with the habit of powerful individuals ruthlessly to pursue private interest over the common good, with the constant threat and sometimes the actuality of collapse into tyranny and despotic rule, and with the problem of runaway wealth. Some citizens, like the Alberti, just simply became so rich and amassed so much power thereby that their very existence was a threat to the social cohesion and communal life of the city. Now, Alberti's family had been at the heart of these struggles, as both winners and then losers. And the problems of the 14th century remained a constant motivating factor behind his thinking, not just his thinking about society as a whole, but also about architecture specifically. Marvin Trachtenberg has argued that it was when he witnessed the completion of the dome of Florence Cathedral and wrote his letter to Brunelleschi that Alberti first began seriously to engage with architecture. I have suggested that his engagement with Florence's monumental buildings was powerfully inflected by his ambivalence regarding the Florentine state, an ambivalence that allowed him to speak in positive tones about the Duomo while remaining markedly negative regarding the government palace. And I have further argued that these initial thoughts about architecture were mediated by a sort of pictorial thinking that he simultaneously developed in the De Pictura. As part of this, I wanted to show how Alberti sometimes thinks about architecture in fascinating ways, even in his non-architectural writings. So it's important that we, as architectural historians, read those too. As it happens, when Alberti turned his hand to architecture itself in later life, he ended up being primarily a maker of facades, producing works full of eclectic references that appear deliberately to exacerbate the tensions between the building as tectonic structure and the building as image. On one level, it seems he was always trying to corral disparate parts into a perfectly ordered picture. Thank you very much.
let me start here with the opening question. It's so fascinating thank you so much for a brilliant, intricately woven talk that guides us through Berti's various writings, but also his personal history, family history. Very excited to see also one of his buildings here in your presentation. I was thinking also about Alberti's cathedral in Mantua, right? And how that project might fit into this construction of history making and this pictorial act, pictorial meaning making, especially in comparison to Brunelleschi's cupola. If you have any thoughts about how he's contrasting himself to Brunelleschi in that process?
Yeah. So Alberti designed two buildings in Mantua, and they had a very strange fortune because one of them was a church, San Sebastiano, and it was really his big chance because the building was being built from scratch, the whole thing. But it went wrong in various ways, and the money ran out, and the patron got distracted, and it was never finished. And then it was messed around with a lot. So we don't really know exactly what it was going to look like. And the other one, which you're referring to, is the Church of Sant'Andrea, which we know that Alberti, so he writes to the Marquis of Mantua saying, here you're going to rebuild Sant'Andrea, and there's a design and it's good, but I've got a much better design. I'm going to make you a drawing. I'm going to send it to you. And it seems that it went ahead, but Alberti was dead by the time they even broke the ground, right? So how much he is an author of that building is difficult to say, but some of you might have been there and seen it. And it's a very interesting building. I mean, certainly in terms of the idea of the building as image, and then, as image tectonics kind of relationship, because the facade is really like a sort of separate building almost on the front of it. And all of the orders, you can see that here on the Tempio Malatestiano, you've got these big engaged columns. At Sant'Andrea, they are pilasters, and they're really just kind of they're just tracings. It's almost like they've been drawn on, right? And the whole facade was originally painted. So I feel like his final work, the facade almost does become an image, basically, at that point. And yet, on the interior, it's really the most sort of volumetric, you could say, building that Alberti comes up with, because it has a huge barrel vault and these big vaulted chapels as well. In terms of the differences with Brunelleschi, that's interesting to think about. I mean, certainly there are differences regarding the Tempio Malatestiano, I guess, because he did plan a dome for it, and he wanted the dome not to be the pointed acute fifth that Brunelleschi didn't design it. It was designed many years before, but was building in Florence, but rather a kind of a semisphere, like the Pantheon. Yeah. So, but I mean, the question of Alberti's relationship with Brunelleschi is a very vexed and difficult one. And we just don't know what their relationship was at all, because all we have is one letter from Alberti to Brunelleschi. So, Brunelleschi might have just read that and been like, who are you? And put it aside. Or he might have said, oh, my great friend Alberti, this is fantastic, let's talk. We just don't know.
Thank you. Yes, come up with the mic, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this talk. And I hate to say that I'm not an architectural historian. I'm going to seize on what Yoko mentioned in her intro of you as a historian of ideas, engaging with the history of ideas. Because I was really enjoying this talk and super following everything along. And suddenly you had a fleeting remark on a slide about a passage from Alberti where he's quoting Quintilian.
Yeah.
And this idea of Quintilian believed that the earliest painters used to draw around shadows made by the sun. And this is sort of, these are the earliest paintings. And I'm fascinated by this in sort of the history of ideas around why I have a horse in this race, and I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts about why is it that people like quintillion, this was not a known passage to me, but Pliny similarly tells this story about the origin of the portrait coming from a silhouette tracing, right?
Yeah.
Shadow. And then again, like the quintillion says, Alberti, eventually the art grew as pieces, as additions. And so someone presses clay into this shadow silhouette to make the first portrait. And I'm wondering, could you speculate as to why you think shadow, right, this immaterial thing, fugitive, elusive, etc., why is this being now in multiple stories the sort of ore material of art?
Thank
you.
No, that's a great question. And if I remember rightly about the Pliny passage, it's more poetical, right? Because it's also to do with kind of absence and longing in a way. Because so Alberti has two origins of painting, and the first is Narcissus, right? So he says that Narcissus who was converted into a flower. So there's also a kind of longing at the origin of painting via a different story there for Alberti. But no, the shadow. Okay, so Alberti is very keen on quintillion, and he relies on quintillion at various points in the treatise, and some have said in a way for the structure of the whole treatise on painting. I suppose the thing with the shadow is it's just pure speculation, right? But is that it's just kind of like a first image, right? It's just the sort of primary image that is cast of oneself apart from a reflection, right? Which is what Narcissus sees. I mean, those are the kind of first images that they're made automatically, right? You don't even have to, they're made without any kind of techne whatsoever. I mean, it feels like there should be a more profound answer than that, but yeah. 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 But no, it is really interesting. And actually when Alberti basically says that one of the things that painters can do is bring back the dead. Right, which is also something that Quintilian says about the prosopopeia that the orator does. So there's definitely that kind of connection there. And I suppose, Alberti is also very interested in friendship, and he writes about that. And of course, the topos of the friend is a sort of second self. So whether the shadow is kind of a second self as well, whether there's some, I don't know, but it's it's a great question. Yeah. Michael.
Thanks again for your talk. I'm really interested in the way you're reading these texts and how much you get out of them. And I'm wondering especially about your identification of this pictorial mode of thinking, which I think is fascinating. And I guess my question about that is to what degree you see that as kind of an authorial idiosyncrasy for Alberti, or is it part of a broader habit of a particular social group who tend to look at the world that way?
Well, that's a good question. So I think there's something very particular about Alberti that I think actually a painting occupies this key role in his thinking, actually above architecture, in some ways above writing. And there's this very interesting passage in the Momus, which it's a bit like a novel. Alberti wrote this novel basically in Latin, which tells the story of the god of harsh criticism. It's very sort of satirical. But there's a part in it where Charon, the ferryman to the underworld, is having a conversation with a dead philosopher. And the philosopher's trying to do philosophy with him. And Charon's just like, this is all nonsense. This is all just wordplay. And he says, I'm going to tell you the truth about human beings. And I didn't hear it from a philosopher. I heard it from a painter. He says, all your philosophy is just wordplay. Painters looking at lineamenta, lines and angles, know more than all of you philosophers do when you're measuring the heavens, doing astronomy, all of these things. So, and maybe that's just a comic interlude, but I don't think so, actually. I think that for Alberti, painting was incredibly significant. And it was partly significant because it, in some way, was prior to and beyond language. And, Alberti is so good at language. But of course, being so good at language, he's hyper aware of how slippery language is. He's hyper aware of polysemy in language and how it can mean different things because he does it himself all the time. But he says this thing in his autobiography. So Alberti wrote his autobiography when he was in his 30s, in the third person in Latin. So something to look forward to when you get to your 30s, if you haven't already, something to plan for. And he has these amazing remarks. And he says, he says he loved the study of letters, which he considered to be like fragrant blossoms. And yet at other times, they would pile up under his eyes like scorpions so that he could do anything rather than continue to read. So he has this kind of odd relationship with language, but he's never negative about painting. And, he even says that when he was painting, just hours went by and he didn't realize, all of that kind of stuff about flow and so on. I think that for Alberti, the thing about painting is that it's the perfect sort of fusion of moral and mathematical reasoning. It's kind of moral philosophy because it's an inquiry and it's a story. So he's thinking of historia right back etymologically to meaning an inquiry, but also it's mathematical. And it has that kind of mathematical precision that gets away from the ambiguity of language. So that's a slightly rambling answer, but I think painting is right at the heart for Alberti. He's sometimes very negative about architecture. He satirizes architecture ruthlessly in the Momus. So the same time Alberti is writing an architectural treatise, he's writing this novel where he's just like, the architects are building things that are falling down, and it's kind of, two different sides of the same coin.
Maybe one last question here, unless there's a hand in the audience online. Could you, because we have a lot of students in the audience tonight who may be coming to Alberti for the first time, could you say something about why Alberti is a figure that continues to matter today, right? Why should students read him, right? What do you think in 2025, right?
Yeah.
Just sort of stepping back a second, thinking about why young people might gain from engaging with this 15th century figure.
Yeah. Well, Alberti is surprisingly modern as an author, and he's modern in the way that he continually reflects on authorship, right? And even where I was talking at the end there about this idea of dismemberment, right? I think what's one of the things that's really going on behind that is Alberti's always thinking about authorial identity, right? He's actually thinking about the kind of, when he's thinking about sort of dismemberment, the loss of meaning, it's really to do with somehow the destruction of the author. Alberti's very cagey. He was exiled, but then of course he was allowed back in. He keeps going on about being an exile, even after, he's no longer an exile. Well, partly he must have never felt that he really fitted back in, and he's quite clear about that. In other ways, it's a poetic stance. He's part of a tradition of authors who use exile as the idea of being an outsider. It's quite a modern, at least to us, it feels like a modern idea of authorship, right? That the author is kind of an outsider who has to stand alone in some way. So Alberti is sort of both wanting to be in the center and always outside on the periphery at the same time. In terms of the kind of subjects that he's talking about, as I said at the end there, well, some of the things that are really concerning Alberti, how does one maintain a participatory government? How does one preserve the state? What is the relationship of architecture to the state? What is the relationship of wealth to the state? I mean, these are all questions, right, for us today, no doubt. So, I think he remains relevant in all sorts of ways. I mean, there's obviously lots of ways in which he's completely sort of seems completely archaic to us. He has some terrible views about some things. And if you read the treatise on the family, there's a whole section where Giannozzo explains how one should treat one's wife. And it's just like, it's unbelievable, appalling misogyny. So, you know, Alberti is also very unmodern in lots of ways, and has to be kind of handled robustly, and certainly not just kind of, certainly not idealized. But there's also other ways in which, you know, he's a pretty extraordinary writer and quite fun to read.
Richard, okay. One last question, and
Yeah.
then we'll call it a night.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm trying to remember who the author was. I want to say it was John O'Niens, who may have suggested that one of the things we owe to Alberti is that he basically elevated architecture to the status of a legitimate profession.
Yeah.
Whereas previously it was the realm of the traveling kind of builder.
Yeah.
And he did that by pulling out of Vitruvius, especially this, you know, the idea of sacred number and proportion.
Yeah.
And comparing it to music with its kind of numerical kind of basis. And I'm just wondering what you, in that sense, in doing that, he basically he legitimizes architecture as a profession for the first time.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you think about that and whether that's.
Well, it's an interesting subject, because that is indeed what people have said, that Alberti, in a way, invents the modern idea of the architect. You know, right at the beginning of his treatise, he says, "Here I consider architect who, through, you know, the ingenious moving of weights and doing this and that, is able to build these things." And he talks about all the elevated disciplines that architects have to know. So he, you know, the architect has to be an expert in the liberal arts and all of these things. Ironically, that has, in more recent years, that's become something that people point to really say that Alberti is a problem, right? Because they say, well, in the Middle Ages, there was this really much more organic sense of how you made a building. And Alberti, who's a writer, comes along and turns it into authorship. Whereas, you know, building a medieval cathedral, well, all sorts of people were involved. There wasn't a complete plan beforehand. They used time. You know, this is Trachtenberg's argument. And then Alberti comes along, who's a writer, and says you have to plan everything to every detail before you start, and then do it as quickly as possible so no one can change it. And it's your design, right? So he kind of makes it authorial. So it's kind of used against Alberti. At the same time, the definition is also used against Alberti in another way, often by the same people, who say, and you know what, Alberti wasn't even an architect, because he wasn't an architect according to what we think of now as a professionalized architect, because he was actually a writer, he was a dilettante. So I think it's right what you're saying, and the effect on how he's been perceived in historiography is quite interesting, often opposite to what we might assume.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the speaker. So much.